All right, so we're going to talk today about spirituality and recovery in the context of addiction. And we're going to talk a lot about why spirituality is, I would argue, a pretty necessary component of addiction recovery, even for people who don't acknowledge that that's what they're doing. It's a really interesting concept and one that meets with some controversy, particularly the newer generation is very excited about atheism. And they like to pretend that atheism isn't a religion, which is hysterical. What they really mean is they're excited about getting away from an anthropomorphic projection of God. Anthropomorphic is a $10 word for basically a dude up in the sky, the traditional idea of God. And that can actually be a bit challenging for some people as well. The first thing we want to talk about, if we're going to talk about spirituality, is we have to talk about religion. You can't talk about spirituality without religion. And the first question, of course, is, are they the same thing?
No.
Okay, I agree. What's the difference between the two? How am I going to define religion versus spirituality with a client? That's a really important discussion to be able to have.
Religion is like a specific set of beliefs. Spirituality is
broader term.
Yeah.
That's a great way of putting it, I think. So religions have a couple things in common. One, they're collective.
They have a set of rules.
Yeah, they're collective, and they have a set of rules. I like that.
Do's and do not.
Yep. And they're designed to be communal in nature. And what that means is they're designed to form a group of people who are in and people who are out. Now, people want to poo-poo that, but there's some value in having a tribe of people with like-minded values and belief systems that are similar, in that then you can cooperate. You don't have to fight with each other all the time. In regular life, in tribal worlds at least, it was pretty challenging to find some people who you could cooperate with, and what better basis to do so than on religion. So religion, as I would define it, go ahead.
Religion perhaps also is the collective, but it's organized and surrounded by a certain personality. Jesus, Buddha, Muhammad, there's the prophet that received a revelation, let's say.
Sure.
And so there's that.
That makes sense.
Spirituality, you can be spiritual perhaps without there being a primary personality.
That's a really good point. I've given this lecture 100 times and never once thought about that, and that's a really good point. And the personality piece is actually one of the primary. We're going to take a brief bunny trail. Why do people get irritated about religion? Well, there's a lot of different reasons, but here's the core that I'll tell you psychologically anyway. Take somebody's father when they're 3 years old. Somebody's dad when they're 3 years old, and it can be their mom too, depending on the circumstances. But take their father when they're 3 years old. Ask them when they come into recovery about what they think about God, and they will describe what the 3-year-old thought of their father. Okay? There are going to be some people in a religious setting who say, what did God want to have to do with me? And a lot of times, they're not going to have a dad. There's some people that are going to say, I think God's a jerk. I don't want anything to do with God. And what you're going to find there is somebody who has a dad who's a tyrant. And there's lots of what they call projection onto God as a result of that. When do most people stop getting their formal religious education? In the West, formal religious education basically concludes with catechism class or with that junior high school sort of initiation process that most formal religious traditions have or had up until the 21st century. And that was the end of formal religious education. When do most people pick the religion that they grow up in? Most people who have a religion found it prior to the age of 12. A lot of people will walk away from religion in college because it's kind of a trendy thing to do. But when you talk to people about their complaints about this, it's very much related to this. Very much related to there being some patriarchal personality at the top of the religious process, and them having a problem right here.
Who does he think he is, and why should I hear this kind of thing?
More or less. Now, that doesn't make their argument wrong. Okay? It doesn't make what they say about religion incorrect. But it's really important to understand with our clients, and it doesn't mean that we can't, with our clients, most of them have a pretty rough relationship with their father if they had one at all. Okay? Again, if I have somebody who is agnostic, just they don't know about God, they haven't thought much about God, Try this. See how many times you find out they had a dad who didn't know much about them and didn't think much about them. See how often somebody who has walking away from religion can be actually quite liberating for some people. If you have a religion that imposes a God upon you that's a tyrant, why would you not walk away? It can be a healing process. There was a Christian therapist. He wrote a book called The Road Less Traveled. M. Scott Peck was his name. His book has been quite widely published and republished. It's considered a classic in self-help literature, The Road Less Traveled. When he wrote that one, he was an atheist. Later, he converted to Christianity, and he said he had a real challenge. In The Road Less Traveled, he talked a lot about the idea that the most important thing a therapist can do is serve the needs of the client ahead of their own. And he said he became a Christian and later realized that there were times when the people he talked to, what was best for them was actually to walk away from the religion that they were a part of. That was what was the most instrumental thing for their particular growth. In part, it had to do with this idea of the tyrant that can be sort of put onto Godhead or figurehead through the cult personality that shows up in religion. Right? So that's one thing that can be really helpful in terms of talking to clients when they're trying to decide, Greg, I don't like the idea of steps 2 and 3 in AA. AA is not right for me. Well, hang on a second. What is this idea of God that you have? Where did you get it from? Let's really start to deconstruct this thing and see if what AA is talking about and what you're talking about are the same thing. In fact, they might not even be related. They might be completely different. So let's talk this over. So these are the parts about religion. So the way I have defined religion in the past, effectively, is as follows: a system of values and beliefs around which I organize my life. Fairly broad. Does that fit for everybody? Yeah, a system of values and beliefs around which I organize my life. Now, spirituality, well, spirituality is something completely different. Spirituality is individual and, as a result, subjective connection with a power greater than self. See there? Think about your upbringing. If you're like me, I grew up in a pretty prideful and sort of angry Christian setting. And so I knew a lot of people who were religious and who I'm convinced now maybe weren't very spiritual. Does that sound fair?
Yeah.
And when I've been to 12-step meetings and enjoyed 12-step fellowship, I've met people who are spiritual, but who I don't think necessarily are religious per se. And I've run into people too who have a strong connection with nature or something like that, or a deep connection with what they perceive to be God in clinical settings that don't necessarily adhere to the traditional sense of religion. So the two are not necessarily connected. Fair? Now, that said, if I go back into my history, I went to college and I got a degree in religion, and I got it so I could argue with people. I had a kind of a negative motivation for it. I was very, very angry at, I thought, Christianity. In reality, I had some of my own unfinished business to take care of. So I have a degree in basically all the reasons why I can argue against Christianity, which actually was also facilitated a very quick bottom for me. Getting a degree in what you don't believe in is a great way to come to some sort of spiritual crisis point. During that process, I had classmates in my college, about a third of whom didn't give a crap about religion, and they were just there because it had a good music school and a good pre-med school. A third of whom were deep believers, but I would say they probably qualified as religious without being spiritual, and these are the folks I decided to take umbrage with and argue with all the time. And then a third of whom were people who were both religious and spiritual. And I got to tell you, a lot of the time I would spend time with these folks and come away thinking, man, that's somebody who has something I want. I wish, because I was a beacon of humility, of course. So I said to myself, I wish I could set aside my massive intellectual prowess, which clearly takes away the the prospect that there could be anything to what they believe in, because that looks kind of nice. And actually, when we look at the studies of religious people, we discover that people, now again, we can't study spirituality scientifically, right? Because it's subjective. What does subjective mean? It means it's my own internal experience. You can't measure it. Love is subjective. If you've ever asked your partner or your spouse, do you love me? They say yes. You got to kind of take their word for it, right? Now you can look at the actions that they're taking and see and suspect, but you can't really know what's happening inside, right? That's what it means when it's subjective. So science can't measure spirituality. Science is the domain of the measurable and the repeatable. We get into trouble with science if we try to make it do things besides measure things and repeat things. It'll tell you exactly what is, but it won't answer the question of how or who you should be. It has nothing to do with what matters, what's valuable. It can't measure any of that. It can try though, and it did. Lots of scientific studies, some of them are older now because I've been out of school for a while, that study the impact of being religious. People who are religious, measured by the observance of religious traditions and participation in religious institutional stuff, going to church, aka or synagogue or whatever. People who do that have a much higher likelihood of telling you that they're happy with their life, a much lower likelihood of getting a divorce, okay? And they go to the doctor less often. So theoretically, anyway, they do have, there's some merit, there's something to this thing that I picked up on. But again, I couldn't just set aside the conclusions I had drawn about the world and kind of drink the Kool-Aid, right? So we're going to come back to that in a second. For now, let's do a thought experiment together. I want you to picture, if you're like me, you probably have some people in your life who are religious and not spiritual. And maybe you even have religious trauma. What's religious trauma? Well, it's any kind of trauma at the hands of a religious caregiver. In my family system, okay, the religious caregivers sometimes were pretty dysfunctional and pretty challenging. I've had people who've been abused, sexually abused, or by a priest, for example. I've had clients who've had that happen to them. So that's a really significant and deep religious trauma. So we have people like that, and perhaps you've known people like that, and people who've offered you some good old-fashioned judgment, which is super fun and painful and shaming and not very enjoyable. But if you're like me, you also have people who you've run into who are religious and spiritual, and they're actually just really good people, and who you think, geez, that's pretty nice. Okay, for me, it was my mom. My mom was religious and spiritual and always just really tried to be kind. And for the most part, did a pretty good job. Not without flaw or fault, but who is? But when you sit and think about somebody like that, okay, somebody who's deeply religious and deeply spiritual, we have a different experience. We're going to come back to that in a second. I said before, I want to get to this thought experiment. How many of you remember the first time you got high? Anybody? Or drunk, if you're an alcoholic. Yeah, everybody, right? So that's the thing. Everybody, when they get high, you take and use your drug of choice for the first time, how do you feel? How'd you feel? Great?
I got sick.
Oh, I got sick? All right. How'd you feel? Straight into psychosis? Okay. Well, this is a different response that I'm accustomed to getting. As a general rule, we have, and that's okay, I appreciate it. As a general rule, when I get high for the first time, or possibly the second or third time, I have an experience that's pleasurable. Okay. When you had, so let me ask the question again a different way. When you use your drug of choice and found it enjoyable, most of us have a particular experience, usually early, that was a peak experience with getting high. And after that peak experience, we chase that experience again for the rest of our career as addicts. Does that sound familiar?
Yes.
When you had that, we're going to take a second, we're going to pause time, because that's what our brain does. Our brain says, who cares about the consequences? Don't forget about that. What is that? How did you feel the first time you did meth and it was awesome? The first time you smoked crack and it was awesome? Or the first time you did heroin and it was awesome? How'd you feel?
I felt like I could breathe.
Like I could breathe. So what is that? Is it like relaxed? At peace?
No, I felt like I could breathe. I mean, prior to that, I felt like I was suffocating all the time.
Yeah.
And it allowed me just to breathe and sit without some metaphor, of course, but
Yeah. Breathe and
imagine being
sit.
out of breath, just
Yeah.
stressed and out of breath.
So
let's
let's,
focus on breathing, and that allowed me to breathe and to look around and see shit.
less stress, right?
Yeah.
What else?
I wasn't dying anymore.
Superman. Oh, I love that one. Superman. Not dying anymore. What else? Good ones. Invisible? Oh, yeah. And what is invisible about? What's the benefit of being invisible? Untouchable. Invulnerable, really, right? Yeah, yeah. I can do anything. Powerful.
Yeah.
Anybody, we say less stress, what we really mean is like pain and fear and shame, right? Does that sound fair? So less pain, fear, shame. That's a good one. Okay?
Help me forget.
Forget what? What we don't say.
Whatever I didn't want to remember.
Exactly, yeah. So I could forget, and we're going to get back up to here. Because again, we don't try to numb out all the joyful experiences of childhood, right? I tell this to clients all the time. Client comes and sees me and says, Greg, why are things getting worse? Why is all this stuff in here? And I said, well, you haven't spent the last decade numbing out, all the joy and happiness you had as a kid. That's not the part you're hiding from. It's not the part you want to go away. It's the other stuff, and it's all been sitting there, and now it's coming. So off you go. Helps me breathe, less stress, Superman, not dying anymore, invulnerable, powerful, less pain. I forget my pain, my fear, my shame. What else? This is really good stuff.
Letting some secret.
Special.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Especially with meth.
Oh yeah. Meth is really good at that, isn't it?
Yeah.
So special.
Really am. Yeah.
Yeah.
Comfortable in my own skin.
Comfortable. Anybody get better looking? Anybody get better looking? No, I'm the only one? Yeah, well, again, one of the things, by the way, one of the ways we judge how attractive somebody is the symmetry of their face. Guess what the first thing alcohol impacts is? Our capacity to judge symmetry. Isn't that interesting? I read that someplace. Yeah, so a couple of you guys have had the experience of feeling like somebody else is really good looking, and then later on discovering that perhaps you were impaired in your assessment of that. That assessment was an impaired assessment of some sort, right? And what that's about, sex in that situation is really about feeling a sense of connection. Make sense? Yeah, so I'm feeling a real sense of connection, and the social element of that is really important. Social, especially. Okay, so this is a pretty good assessment of what happens the first time you have one of those super powerful, I call them conversion experiences. When you have a conversion experience where you change around what matters to you, because you have this experience and you say, that was awesome, everything else not as awesome. We're going to do this for a while. Okay, we're going to ride this train and see how it goes. So I want to take, a second ago I was talking about your memory or your experience of a human being in your life who maybe has both spirituality and religion. And we'll just talk about them as being connected to HP, to the higher power. Now, take that person and ask yourself, and sometimes it helps to compare them to myself right about the time I got addicted, right about the time I got in there. Could this person breathe better than me? That's pretty subjective. It's hard to tell. I don't know if it fits or not. I'm guessing yes, honestly, but I don't know if I can make a strong argument. Did they have less stress than me? Well, I don't know. I was pretty stressed out when I got into addiction. And these people I hung out with who were spiritual and religious, or even just spiritual, I didn't have any people who were just spiritual. I didn't know what that meant at the time. Spiritual and less religious, yeah, they were a lot less stressed than me. Did they feel like Superman? Well, no. Well, find me a religion that doesn't have a teaching about the afterlife. Spoiler alert, they're pretty hard to come by. Although I would argue that atheism is a religion, and environmentalism can be too, so maybe. The idea of an afterlife, though, is pretty essential for most religious folks. A feeling of Superman and a feeling of connected to a power. I mean, the name is power greater than self, right? I'm feeling connected to something that is powerful. I feel like I'm not dying anymore. So again, if we're going to dig into what is a religion and what makes a religion of value, contending with the threat of your own impending death is pretty fundamental to that, right? Invulnerable, same thing. Powerful, same thing. Made that argument already. Less pain, fear, and shame. Well, I already told you, or I forget my pain, fear, and shame. I already told you the studies are really clear. People who are religious report substantially, measurably less pain, fear, and shame. Doesn't mean they don't have any. Lord, far from it. Do they have less than me, particularly prior to addiction? Yeah. Me and my addiction, I was pretty filled with all those things. Special. I would say most people are going to report they feel special with their higher power or a sense of specialness as a result. How about connection and social connection? Shit, that's what a religion's about, isn't it? When I felt comfortable in my skin. Again, same thing. So what are we noticing here? What are we seeing?
Spirituality could do the same thing as our religion.
That's exactly right. What we're figuring out here, when we talk about the idea of spirituality in the context of recovery, what we're really discovering is that the difference, you always have to ask yourself, I'm going to open the door. You always have to ask yourself, what's the difference between, anybody know somebody who is like this? The difference between somebody who's an alcoholic or an addict who will use, I heard today a definition that an addict is somebody who has a progressively narrowing definition of what is fun and good and what they like. Anybody know somebody who can use meth a couple times and just be like, yeah, I'm good?
I've heard stories.
I've actually met people, legends and myths. That was my plan. So we know somebody, if you know somebody who has picked up heroin, about a third of people who use heroin get addicted to it. Did you know that? It's the most addictive substance on earth. You know what the third most addictive substance on earth, according to this particular study, was? Nicotine. Yeah. Heroin, meth, nicotine, then crack. Yeah. So anyway, just tells you something about cigarettes, but whatever. Some other time we'll get to that thing. So what's the difference between somebody who uses recreationally or who uses for a while and puts it down versus somebody else who is an addict and who develops a complete lifestyle, a complete community built around their drug of choice? I would argue to you that the difference is this. The drug of choice has become a system of beliefs and values around which they organize their life. Make sense? So why is it hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of years, Western medicine spent trying to figure out the whole alcoholism thing? We're all dying so fast for a long time that people didn't spend too much time with it.
We're built to organize our life around values, system of values and beliefs. That's the kind of things we are.
Right.
And that you need some sort of structure in place for the substitute to go back to spirituality or whatever you want to call it. Slowly, and then drop the addict.
And that's essentially what we're getting at here, right? We're getting at this idea. We're getting at this idea of the system of values and beliefs around which I structure my life. If I have a conversion experience, what does that mean? Anybody ever know somebody who had a conversion experience to a religion? And what do? You go tell other people, right? Anybody in here ever carry the message of addiction to someone else? How many of you guys brought addiction to your friends or family members? Say, man, you got to try this. This is great. And why wouldn't you? Now you feel terrible about it, right? I've had a lot of people, they'll introduce their brother or their sister, and then their sibling dies, overdoses. And that's like an old story to me. Like I can't remember how many clients I've had who tell me that story, or their best friend. Okay, whatever it is for them. There are probably people in this room who've had that happen. Why wouldn't you carry the message? You found something that's great, and it doesn't. In the beginning, it has no consequences. People tell you it might later, but whatever. And if I'm miserable, if I can't breathe, and all of a sudden I can, why would you not take that to someone else? You're kind of selfish of you not to, honestly. Well, of course you did. Of course you did. So when it comes to explaining to our clients the idea, what I always tell people is, you already have a religion. You just didn't pick a very good one. And I understand why you did it. Which is more fun in junior high? Praying to, meditating or drinking? How about drinking personally? Praying and meditating had pretty spotty results. Drinking was really dependable. It was incredibly consistent. Prayer and meditation, yeah, I wasn't quite as convinced there. Didn't work out quite that way. Okay? In junior high school is when we get started with our addiction. We have most of us, some of us, and usually you start with something small and then you work your way up. You can't really get good drugs in junior high, generally speaking. It takes a little bit. Some of you are real resourceful. It came from a pretty rough part of town, but for the most part, you have to wait a couple of years before you can get into the heavy stuff. But again, this idea of, look at all this benefit. Look at all this payoff. I had a friend one time, and he said, my sponsor said to me, if you could still use without consequence, would you? He told his sponsor, no. And his sponsor said, you're a fucking liar. No way. Who would not use? Who would not have all this if it didn't have terrible, terrible consequences? Nobody. Everybody would do this. So what we tell folks is the idea of religion is something everybody has, as far as I can tell. Now, we can take a look at atheism, and we can do this. I don't totally understand the values or beliefs that come out of atheism. We can take a look at agnosticism. Somewhere, even people who think they're agnostic and they're atheist, almost always they have something around which they organize their life. It might be money, it might be sex, it might be acceptance, it might be fame. There's a lot of fun things you can get addicted to if you start to understand addiction as based in this. The reality is everybody's religious. Everybody is religious. Everybody has a system of values and beliefs around which they organize their life. And the biggest question everybody who comes in here has to contend with is the reality that the system that they have built isn't working. It is broken. It is desperately broken. And my job is to say, here's a different system. It worked for me. Perhaps it would work for you as well. Would you like to change literally everything about your life and everything about how you see and understand the world? And if the answer is no, which it is, I think at least 80% of the time, so okay, we'll be here when you get back. Does that make sense? Billy?
Not really.
Oh, Will.
Yeah,
Sorry.
it's okay. Religion, the word religion, people like do like this, but then I ask people like, don't you ever go to the gym religiously or brush your teeth religiously? And just tell me that word that is heavy and ominous.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not the system around which you organize your life, and you do these things religiously.
Right. And religion, and the reason religion is hard for people is this thing. And then also in our culture, religion has become synonymous with like bigotry and racism and stuff like that. Okay. So, or exclusion or whatever it is. And that's become, the culture has decided that that is now the worst thing, which again, that is just a new religion, right? There's one set of religion that says this is the highest good, and another religion that says this is the highest good, and they're fighting with each other right now. The other one seems to be winning. It's my candid observation of that. But yeah, that's exactly right. Okay, so I think that's probably a pretty good stopping point. There's like 500 other things I could say about this, but this is, in terms of understanding how to approach a client when it comes to why the 12 steps are an effective tool. Do you see where the 12 steps idea of let's present the idea, what thousands of years of addiction, why would a con man, which is what Bill Wilson was, and a proctologist, which is what Dr. Bob was, doesn't that sound like a joke? A con man and a proctologist walk out of a bar. It's the fun kind of a joke, isn't it? These two guys walk out of a bar, they start AA, and now there's millions and millions of people. Why does AA work? Because they figured this out. They figured out that for addiction, for an addict, addiction is just a religion. And if I change my religion, I can get better. And think about what I just said. Think about that. Hey, all you have to do to get better is change your religion. How many of us have a religion of some kind? About half. And how many of you, if I gave a really good lecture, would change it? Every once in a while I get somebody who's like, yeah, I'm kind of looking. I'm shopping. I'm in the market right now. But as a general rule, we're pretty set on that. we really like the way we see the world. We really feel like it's right, and we're gonna kind of ride that thing out, often to death. History's full of people who die for their religion, right? So that's what I tell people. I just remind people of that because this job is hard sometimes. You will see you will bury a lot of friends. We had another client die last week. Right? It came through here a couple years ago. You will bury a lot of people because a lot of people will choose this. Okay? Will choose their current religion over life.